Elijah Boone had lived alone for so long that the silence no longer felt strange. It was simply part of the land, as natural as the wind sweeping across the Wyoming prairie or the sun rising over the endless stretch of grass. For 20 years he had woken before dawn, brewed his coffee strong and black, and stepped outside to face another day with only his horse and his thoughts for company. The small ranch house bore the marks of a life untouched by softness, boots by the door, a table scarred by time, a single chair pulled close to the stove. There were no photographs on the walls, no reminders of what once had been, because Elijah had learned that memories were heavier than any saddle he ever lifted. Once long ago, a woman had shared this place with him. Clara had arrived like spring after a brutal winter, filling the house with warmth, laughter, and dreams he had never dared to have before her. She talked about curtains and children, about turning the ranch into a home rather than just a shelter from the elements. Elijah loved her, but he had never learned how to say it in ways that mattered. When they argued, his silence cut deeper than any harsh word. One bitter morning, after a fight neither of them could undo, she packed her things and left before the sun rose. Elijah watched her walk down the dirt road and told himself she would come back. She never did. The years passed slowly. His hair turned gray, his back stiffened, and the town stopped asking questions. Folks tipped their hats and called him the lone cowboy, a man carved from solitude. Elijah accepted the title because it hurt less than hope. He convinced himself that this was the life he chose, that loneliness was easier than risking loss again. Still, some nights he sat on the porch and stared at the horizon, wondering what his life might have been if he had followed her. That morning seemed no different from the thousands before it. The air was cold, the sky pale with early light, and Elijah was mending a broken fence when he heard a sound that did not belong. A knock, sharp, deliberate. His heart stumbled as he walked to the door, irritation mixing with disbelief. No one ever came out this far. When he opened it, time seemed to fold in on itself. A woman stood there, older, worn by years, yet achingly familiar. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw the past he had buried. "Elijah," she said softly. "It's me." Elijah stood frozen in the doorway, his hand still gripping the worn wood as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Seeing Clara again felt like staring into a life he had already lived and lost. The years had changed her. Fine lines traced her face, and her hair, once dark and loose, was streaked with silver, but her eyes were the same, carrying a sadness that stirred something deep and painful in his chest. For a moment neither of them spoke. The wind moved across the porch, tugging at her coat, filling the silence with memories. "Clara," he finally said, her name breaking from his throat like a confession. He had rehearsed angry speeches in his mind over the years, imagined what he might say if she ever returned, but none of it mattered now. All he could feel was the weight of her presence and the ache of 20 unfinished years. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, her voice unsteady. "I don't expect anything from you. I just needed to see you." Her hands clutched a small leather bag as though she might bolt if he raised his voice or close the door. Elijah stepped aside without thinking. The choice felt instinctive, as if some part of him had been waiting for this moment all along. Inside, the house seemed different with her in it, smaller and fuller at the same time. Clara glanced around slowly, taking in the bare walls, the rough table, the single place set by habit rather than intention. Her gaze lingered on the window by the stove, and Elijah knew she remembered standing there once, watching for his return at dusk. They sat across from each other, a pot of coffee between them growing cold. Words came slowly, carefully, like men crossing thin ice. Elijah asked where she had been, and Clara gave him fragments, towns that never felt like home, jobs that barely paid, relationships that never lasted. When he asked why she left all those years ago, her hands began to shake. "I was scared," she whispered. "I thought I was going to lose myself here, waiting for you to notice me." Tears welled in her eyes and she looked away. "And there was more. I was carrying a child, Elijah. I didn't know how to tell you." The truth settled heavily between them. She told him how she had lost the baby on the road, how grief and guilt had chased her ever since. Elijah listened in silence, his chest tight, realizing the depth of the pain they had both carried alone. That night, as thunder rolled across the plains and rain tapped against the roof, they lay awake in separate rooms, bound together by the same question neither dared to ask, whether it was too late to begin again. Morning came quietly, the kind of pale dawn that softened the edges of everything it touched. Elijah rose early out of habit and found himself listening for sounds that weren't there, then realizing they were footsteps, the faint clink of a cup against the counter. Clara was awake too. The knowledge unsettled him in a way he hadn't felt in decades. He poured coffee for two without asking, and when she joined him at the table, their eyes met briefly before drifting away again, both afraid of what too much looking might reveal. The day unfolded slowly. Elijah worked the ranch as he always did, but Clara followed at a careful distance, watching, sometimes offering help. She held fence posts while he hammered, brushed dust from her hands, and smiled at small things as if trying to memorize them. Her presence stirred memories he thought time had buried: shared labor, quiet companionship, the simple comfort of not being alone. Yet beneath it all ran a current of tension, unspoken fears pressing against every moment. By afternoon, Elijah could bear it no longer. They sat on the porch, the land stretching endlessly before them, and the question he had avoided finally surfaced. "Why now?" he asked, his voice rough. "After all this time, why come back here?" Clara stared at the horizon for a long moment before answering. "Because I ran out of places to hide," she said softly. "And because I'm sick." She turned to him then, her eyes steady but wet. "The doctors found it late. I don't know how much time I have." The words struck him harder than any blow. Elijah stood abruptly and walked away, his boots carrying him toward the far fence line where the wind was, stronger and the memories louder. Anger flared at fate, at her, at himself. He had built his life around the certainty of being alone, had convinced himself he didn't need anyone. Now that fragile structure threatened to collapse. As evening fell, he stopped and looked back at the house. Light glowed in the window, warm and inviting, and for the first time in years it meant something. He realized how empty the days had been without anyone to share them with, how loneliness had been his constant companion despite his stubborn denial. When he returned, Clara was still there, sitting quietly, waiting without asking. They spoke little that night, but something shifted between them. Elijah understood that time, however short or long, was precious. And for the first time since Clara had left, he allowed himself to hope, not for what might have been, but for what still could be. The days that followed settled into a fragile rhythm, each one carrying the weight of what lay ahead. Clara's illness could not be ignored, yet neither of them spoke of it constantly. Instead, they focused on the small things: shared meals, quiet mornings, the comfort of sitting side by side as the sun dipped below the plains. Elijah found himself noticing details he had long overlooked, like the way she hummed softly while washing dishes, or how her smile lingered even when pain shadowed her eyes. The ranch, once a place of solitude, seemed to breathe again, as if it remembered what it meant to be lived in by two hearts instead of one. Eventually, the truth pressed in. Treatment would mean doctors in distant cities, unfamiliar rooms, and long days of uncertainty. Clara knew she had to leave if she wanted a chance, no matter how small. One morning, before Elijah woke, she packed her few belongings with quiet care. Standing in the doorway of the spare room, she paused, her hand resting on the worn frame, as if trying to imprint the place into her memory. She had come back seeking closure, not expecting hope. Elijah watched from the hall, his chest tight. 20 years ago, he had stood just as still and let her walk away, believing that love required no courage. The thought of repeating that mistake filled him with a sharp, unbearable fear. When Clara reached for her bag, he finally spoke. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice unsteady but sure. "I should have said that a long time ago." She turned, tears slipping free. "After everything? After all the hurt?" Her doubt was clear, shaped by years of disappointment. Elijah stepped closer and took her hands, his rough fingers wrapping gently around hers. "I lost you once because I was too proud and too quiet," he said. "I won't lose you again because I'm afraid." The words felt like a promise carved into stone. Clara leaned into him then, sobbing, and Elijah held her as if he were holding back time itself. Outside, the prairie stretched on, vast and unchanged, but something inside him had finally shifted. They left the ranch together that day, not knowing what the future would bring, only knowing they would face it side by side. And as Elijah closed the door behind them, he understood that love, even delayed, was worth every risk.